The platform clock at Union Station read 3:47 p.m. when Derek's phone buzzed for the third time in 5 minutes. I watched his face transform from mild annoyance to complete panic as he read the message, his fingers tightening around the device like a lifeline. We were supposed to catch the 4:15 train to Milwaukee for my sister's wedding rehearsal dinner, our weekend bags already loaded onto the platform cart beside us. The Chicago afternoon sun beat down mercilessly through the station's glass ceiling, and I could feel sweat beginning to form beneath my carefully chosen outfit. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Victoria needs me at the office immediately, Derek announced, not looking up from his phone. There's some crisis with the Morrison account, and she specifically requested me to handle it. His voice carried that familiar tone of self-importance that had become increasingly common over the past 2 years, ever since he'd started working directly under Victoria Sterling, the most demanding executive at Morrison Associates. "Derek, we can't miss the rehearsal dinner," I said, keeping my voice calm despite the frustration building in my chest. "My sister is counting on us. You promised her you'd be there to walk her through the ceremony timing since Dad isn't able to travel anymore." The weight of that promise hung between us. My father's recent stroke had left him unable to make the trip, making Derek's presence even more significant for my family. He finally looked up from his phone, but his eyes held no warmth, only calculation. "Rachel, you don't understand how important this account is to my career. Victoria chose me specifically because she trusts my judgment. This could be the break I've been waiting for." His voice dropped to that patronizing tone I'd grown to despise. "Besides, it's just a rehearsal dinner. You can handle your family for one night." The dismissive way he said "your family" hit me like a physical blow. These were the people who had welcomed him with open arms from the moment we started dating 5 years ago, who had included him in every holiday and celebration, who had supported his career moves even when it meant months of long-distance dating. Now he spoke of them like they were strangers, whose concerns barely registered on his radar. "Just a rehearsal dinner?" I repeated, my voice rising slightly. "Derek, this isn't some casual gathering. Sarah specifically asked you to stand in for Dad. She's been planning this for 8 months, and you knew how important." "Look, I don't have time to argue about this," he interrupted, waving his hand dismissively. "You're being emotional and unreasonable. Take the train, go to your family thing, and I'll catch up tomorrow if I can." Victoria said this might take all night, but if we nail this presentation it could mean a promotion to senior associate. The casual way he reduced my sister's wedding to a family thing, while elevating his boss's last-minute demands to life-changing importance, crystallized something that had been building for months. I thought about all the dinners cut short because Victoria called, all the weekend plans canceled because she needed Derek to review documents, all the times he'd chosen her approval over our relationship without a second thought. "You're choosing her again," I said quietly, the words carrying more weight than I'd intended. "You're choosing Victoria over me, over us, over commitments you made to people who love you." Derek's jaw tightened, and I saw something cold flash in his eyes. "I'm choosing my career over drama, Rachel. There's a difference. Maybe if you understood what it takes to succeed in a competitive field, you'd support me instead of guilt-tripping me about some party." The word party was the final straw. My sister's wedding, my father's inability to participate, my family's need for support during an emotional time, all reduced to a trivial social event that couldn't compete with his boss's demands. I felt something fundamental shift inside me, like a foundation cracking under too much pressure. "Fine," I said, my voice steady despite the tremor in my hands. "Go to Victoria, handle your crisis, be the indispensable employee she apparently needs you to be." Relief flooded his face so quickly that it revealed how little internal conflict he'd actually experienced. "Thank you for understanding. I knew you'd see reason once you thought about it logically." He leaned forward to kiss my cheek, but I stepped back slightly, creating distance between us. I said, "Fine, Derek. I didn't say I understood." He was already pulling out his phone again, fingers flying across the screen as he typed what was presumably an eager response to Victoria. "I'll call you tonight after the meeting. Have fun with your family, and tell Sarah I'm sorry I couldn't make it." The apology was perfunctory, delivered without even looking at me as he lifted his bag from our cart. "Where are you going?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "Back to the office. Victoria's sending a car to pick me up outside." He finally looked at me again, and I was struck by how little regret I saw in his expression. "You'll be fine, Rachel. You're always fine." Those words would echo in my mind for months afterward. "You're always fine." As if my adaptability to his choices was a character trait rather than a survival mechanism. As if my ability to handle disappointment was something to be counted on rather than protected. I watched him disappear into the crowd of commuters, his expensive briefcase swinging at his side and his phone pressed to his ear. Even from a distance I could see the animation in his posture as he spoke, presumably to Victoria, arranging his immediate return to serve her needs. The enthusiasm he showed for pleasing his boss stood in stark contrast to the reluctant obligation he'd displayed when discussing my family's celebration. The platform around me continued its usual chaos of arrivals and departures, travelers checking schedules and hauling luggage toward their destinations, families gathered together for journeys, couples coordinated their movements, friends laughed as they shared travel snacks. The normalcy of it all made Derek's abandonment feel even more surreal. How could the world continue its regular rhythm when my marriage had just revealed itself to be a hollow shell? I stood there for several minutes, staring at the spot where he'd disappeared, trying to process what had just happened. My husband had chosen his boss's approval over his wife's needs, his career advancement over his family commitments, his individual ambition over our partnership. More than that, he'd done it without apparent internal struggle, as if the choice had been obvious and my objections unreasonable. The 4:15 train to Milwaukee was now boarding, and I mechanically gathered my bag and walked toward the platform. Sarah was expecting me, depending on me to represent our family in Dad's absence. I couldn't let Derek's choices compound the disappointment my family was already facing. As I settled into my seat and watched Chicago disappear through the window, I felt a strange mixture of hurt, anger, and something else I couldn't quite identify yet. My phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. "Can't wait to see you and Derek. Thank you both for being here when Dad can't. It means everything to me." I stared at the message for a long time before typing back. "Looking forward to seeing you too. Derek had a work emergency and will try to join us tomorrow." I couldn't bring myself to admit the full extent of his abandonment, not yet. Some part of me still hoped he might surprise me, might realize what he'd done, and find a way to make it right. But as the train carried me toward Milwaukee and away from the man I'd thought I knew, I began to understand that this moment wasn't an aberration. It was a revelation. Derek hadn't suddenly become someone who prioritized his boss over his wife. He'd always been that person, and I'd simply been too accommodating, too understanding, too willing to make excuses for him to see it clearly. The wedding rehearsal dinner would be beautiful, I knew. Sarah would glow with happiness, surrounded by family and friends who had prioritized her joy over their individual convenience. I would smile and play my part, covering for Derek's absence with grace and diplomacy. But somewhere deep inside, a seed of understanding was already beginning to sprout. This wasn't about one missed event or one poor choice. This was about a pattern of behavior that revealed fundamental incompatibilities in how we viewed partnership, commitment, and love. The wedding rehearsal dinner passed in a blur of forced smiles and careful explanations. I found myself repeating Derek's excuse about a work emergency to relatives and family friends, each repetition making the words taste more bitter in my mouth. My sister Sarah accepted the explanation with grace, though I caught her exchanging meaningful glances with our mother throughout the evening. They knew Derek well enough to understand that this absence wasn't entirely unexpected, though they were too kind to say so directly. "He's really committed to his career," Sarah said diplomatically, when her maid of honor asked where my husband was. "Rachel's always been so supportive of his ambitions." The words were meant to be complimentary, but they highlighted something I'd been reluctant to examine too closely. When had supporting Derek's ambitions become my primary identity? When had I stopped pursuing my own goals in favor of facilitating his? I'd met Derek during my final semester of graduate school, where I was completing my master's degree in interior design. I'd been passionate about sustainable design practices, excited about the possibility of creating beautiful spaces that also respected environmental principles. My thesis project had focused on adaptive reuse of industrial buildings, transforming abandoned warehouses into vibrant community spaces. I'd received offers from 3 different firms upon graduation, each presenting opportunities to grow my expertise in different aspects of design. But Derek had just landed his position at Morrison Associates, and the demands of his entry-level role were intense. He worked long hours, traveled frequently for client meetings, and needed emotional support as he navigated the competitive world of corporate consulting. It seemed natural for me to take a more flexible position that would allow me to accommodate his schedule. I'd chosen a smaller firm with less prestigious projects but more reasonable hours, telling myself it was a temporary compromise while we both established our careers. Somehow, temporary had become permanent. As Derek's responsibilities grew and his salary increased, my career had remained static. I'd become skilled at rearranging my schedule to accommodate his client dinners, his weekend work sessions, his need for a peaceful home environment where he could decompress from Victoria's demanding expectations. My own projects had become secondary, my professional ambitions postponed indefinitely in service of our shared future. Sitting at the rehearsal dinner, surrounded by Sarah's friends who were excitedly discussing their own career milestones and creative projects, I realized how long it had been since I'd felt passionate about my own work. When had I stopped talking about design with enthusiasm? When had I started measuring my success by how well I supported Derek rather than by my own professional growth? My phone remained conspicuously silent throughout the evening. No calls from Derek checking on the rehearsal, no texts asking how my family was doing, no acknowledgement that he might have made the wrong choice. The absence of communication spoke volumes about how he viewed the situation. In his mind, he'd made a reasonable business decision, and my feelings about it were secondary to the practical reality of advancing his career. After dinner, I found myself walking along the hotel's outdoor terrace with my Aunt Margaret, a woman who had built her own successful catering business from nothing after her divorce 20 years earlier. She'd been watching me throughout the evening with the perceptive eyes of someone who'd once faced similar crossroads. "You know, Rachel," she said gently, her voice carrying the wisdom of experience, "there's a difference between supporting someone's dreams and disappearing into them." She paused, looking out over the Milwaukee skyline. "I spent years of my marriage believing that being a good wife meant making myself smaller so my husband could shine brighter. It took me far too long to realize that the right partner wants you to shine just as brilliantly as they do." Her words hit me with unexpected force. "Derek's career is just more demanding right now," I heard myself saying, the automatic defense I'd perfected over years of explaining his choices to others and to myself. "Once he gets established, things will balance out." Margaret smiled sadly. "Sweetheart, I said the same thing for 15 years. The goalpost just keeps moving. First it was getting established, then it was making partner, then it was landing the big clients. There's always another milestone that requires sacrifice, and somehow it's always your sacrifice being requested, never his." That night, alone in my hotel room, I stared at the ceiling and forced myself to confront some uncomfortable truths. When was the last time Derek had sacrificed something important to him for something important to me? When had he ever chosen my needs over his career advancement or Victoria's demands? I tried to think of examples but came up empty. The pattern was clear once I stopped making excuses for it. My phone finally buzzed at 11:30 p.m. with a text from Derek. "Meeting ran late. Victoria really appreciated my input on the strategy. Hope dinner went well. See you tomorrow night." No apology, no acknowledgement of what he'd missed. No recognition that his choice had cost our relationship something valuable. Just satisfaction with Victoria's appreciation and the assumption that I would continue to be understanding and accommodating. I didn't respond immediately. Instead, I found myself opening my laptop and, for the first time in months, browsing design websites and industry publications. I read about innovative, sustainable building projects, about designers who were pushing boundaries and creating meaningful change through their work. I felt a familiar stirring of excitement, a reminder of who I'd been before I'd molded myself around Derek's career trajectory. Sarah's wedding the next day was everything she'd dreamed it would be. Beautiful, intimate, filled with love and celebration. I walked her down the aisle in place of our father, a role Derek should have shared but had forfeited through his choices. As I watched my sister exchange vows with someone who clearly prioritized their partnership above all else, I felt the sharp contrast with my own marriage. Derek did arrive for the reception, appearing just as dinner was being served with an expensive bouquet and profuse apologies about the work crisis that had kept him away. He charmed my relatives with stories about the important account he'd saved, positioning himself as the hero of a corporate drama rather than acknowledging what his heroics had cost. I watched him work the room, winning over my family with the same charisma that had first attracted me to him, and felt oddly detached from the performance. "Thank goodness you made it," Sarah said warmly, hugging Derek when he approached our table. "Rachel did such a beautiful job walking me down the aisle, but it would have been perfect to have you both there." "I'm so sorry I missed that," Derek replied, and to his credit, he did sound genuinely regretful. "Victoria really needed me to handle this crisis, but I should have found a way to make both work." It was the closest thing to an acknowledgement of poor prioritization that I'd heard from him, though it still positioned Victoria's needs as legitimate and urgent rather than examining whether her demands were reasonable. During the reception, Derek was attentive and charming, dancing with me during the slow songs and making conversation with my relatives about topics that interested them. To outside observers, we probably looked like a happy couple celebrating my sister's milestone, but I found myself analyzing his behavior with new clarity, noticing how he steered conversations toward his work accomplishments, how he presented his dedication to Victoria as evidence of his admirable work ethic, rather than as a threat to our marriage. The train ride back to Chicago the next morning was quiet. Derek worked on his laptop, preparing for Monday's follow-up meetings about the crisis he'd resolved. I stared out the window at the passing landscape and thought about the choices ahead of me. I could continue accepting this dynamic, continue making myself smaller to accommodate his expanding ambitions, continue measuring my worth by how well I supported his dreams while my own withered from neglect. Or I could acknowledge that our marriage had become fundamentally unbalanced, that Derek's priorities were unlikely to change, and that I deserved a partnership where my needs and dreams carried equal weight. The thought terrified me, but also brought an unexpected sense of relief. For the first time in years, I allowed myself to imagine a life where my choices weren't secondary to someone else's career demands, where my passions and goals could take center stage in my own life. As the Chicago skyline came into view, I made a decision that would change everything. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I was going to stop waiting for Derek to prioritize our marriage and start prioritizing myself. I didn't know exactly what that would look like yet, but I knew it would require courage. I wasn't sure I possessed, and changes I wasn't sure I was ready to make. But sitting there on that train, with Derek typing furiously beside me and my sister's happy tears still fresh in my memory, I finally understood that the alternative, continuing to disappear into someone else's ambitions, was no longer acceptable. The seed of transformation had been planted, though I had no idea how dramatically it would grow or where it would ultimately lead me. All I knew was that Rachel Harper, the woman who had always been fine, was about to discover what it meant to refuse to be fine with a life that diminished her worth and potential. The breaking point came 3 weeks after Sarah's wedding, on a Tuesday evening that started like any other. Derek had promised to attend my company's annual design showcase, an event I'd been preparing for months. It was the first time in 2 years that my firm had selected one of my projects for prominent display, and I'd been genuinely excited to share this small professional victory with my husband. I'd spent weeks perfecting my presentation on sustainable office renovation, transforming a dated 1980s corporate building into a modern, energy-efficient workspace that had already attracted inquiries from 3 other companies. The project represented everything I'd originally loved about design work, the perfect blend of aesthetic innovation and environmental responsibility. For the first time in years, I felt like the designer I'd once dreamed of becoming. Derek had circled the date on our calendar, promising to leave work early so we could attend together. He'd even suggested we celebrate afterward at the new restaurant I'd been wanting to try, acknowledging that this recognition was important to my career development. I'd allowed myself to hope that maybe things were shifting, that perhaps he was beginning to understand the need for balance in our relationship. I arrived home at 6:30 to find Derek still in his work clothes, frantically packing documents into his briefcase while talking rapidly on his phone. The familiar knot of disappointment began forming in my stomach as I recognized the signs of another Victoria emergency. He held up one finger to indicate he'd be with me momentarily, but his conversation continued for another 10 minutes while I stood in our entryway, dressed for the showcase in my best professional attire. "Victoria needs me to fly to Detroit tonight," he announced after ending his call, not meeting my eyes as he continued stuffing papers into his bag. "The Hartwell Group is threatening to pull their contract over some miscommunication, and she specifically requested that I handle the damage control. There's a flight leaving at 9:15. The casualness of his tone, as if this were merely a scheduling inconvenience rather than the abandonment of another commitment to me, sparked something dangerous in my chest. "Derek, the showcase starts in 30 minutes. You promised you'd be there." "I know, and I'm sorry, but this is bigger than a company party, Rachel. We're talking about a multi-million-dollar account that could make or break the quarter." He finally looked at me, and I saw no real conflict in his expression, just the mild frustration of someone explaining obvious priorities to someone too naive to understand them. "It's not a company party," I said, my voice carefully controlled. "It's a professional showcase of my work. My project is being featured as an example of innovative, sustainable design. I've been working toward this recognition for 2 years." Derek paused in his packing, seeming to register my tone for the first time. "Okay, I understand it's important to you, but surely you can handle one evening on your own. Network with some people, talk about your project, represent yourself professionally. You're perfectly capable of that." The phrase "handle it on your own" echoed the train station abandonment, revealing a pattern I could no longer ignore. In Derek's mind, I was always capable of handling disappointment, always flexible enough to accommodate his changing priorities, always understanding enough to put his career needs above my own emotional and professional requirements. This isn't about capability, Derek. This is about partnership. This is about showing up for each other when it matters. I set down my purse and faced him directly. "When was the last time you chose me over Victoria? When was the last time you told her that you had prior commitments and couldn't drop everything to solve her problems?" His jaw tightened with irritation. "That's not fair, Rachel. Victoria is my boss, not my friend. I can't just tell her no when there's a legitimate business crisis. You're being unreasonable." "I'm being unreasonable?" The words came out louder than I'd intended. "I'm unreasonable for expecting my husband to honor his commitments to me? I'm unreasonable for wanting you to show up for my professional milestone the way I've shown up for every single one of yours? That's different, and you know it." Derek shot back, his own voice rising. "My career has actual financial implications for our future. Your design work is nice, but it's not exactly paying the bills around here." The dismissive cruelty of that statement hit me like a physical blow. My design work, the passion that had once defined me, the career I'd compromised repeatedly to support his ambitions, reduced to a nice hobby that didn't merit serious consideration. In that moment, I saw our entire relationship with devastating clarity. "Get out," I said quietly. Derek blinked, clearly not expecting that response. "What? Get out? Go to Detroit, handle Victoria's crisis, be the indispensable employee she apparently needs more than I need a husband." I walked to our coat closet and pulled out his travel bag, setting it beside his briefcase. "But don't come back here expecting me to be grateful for the scraps of attention you throw my way when it's convenient. Rachel, you're being dramatic. This is one evening." "This is not one evening." The words exploded out of me with months of suppressed frustration. "This is every evening, every weekend, every holiday, every commitment to me that gets sacrificed the moment Victoria calls. This is 3 years of making myself smaller so you can chase her approval. This is you missing my sister's wedding rehearsal, skipping my birthday dinner, canceling our anniversary plans, all because your boss's needs always come first." Derek stared at me as if I'd suddenly started speaking a foreign language. "My career is important, Rachel. I thought you understood that. I thought you supported my ambitions. I did support them. I gave up job opportunities, social commitments, my own professional development to support them, but support was supposed to be mutual, Derek. Partnership was supposed to mean that we both mattered, that we both made sacrifices for each other's success and happiness." He looked at his watch, then back at me, and I saw the exact moment when he chose Victoria's timeline over our conversation. "Look, I don't have time to discuss this right now. I need to get to the airport. We can talk about this when I get back, and I'm sure we can work something out." The casual dismissal of my feelings, the assumption that this conversation could be postponed for his convenience, crystallized my decision. "No, Derek, we can't work something out, because working something out would require you to see me as an equal partner rather than as a supporting character in your career story." I walked to our bedroom and pulled his largest suitcase from the closet, setting it on our bed. "Take whatever you need for Detroit, and whatever else you'll need for a few weeks. You can stay at your brother's place or get a hotel room. I need time to think, and I need space from someone who sees my needs as optional." Derek followed me, his expression cycling between confusion and anger. "You're kicking me out over a work trip. Rachel, this is insane. Couples don't separate because of scheduling conflicts. This isn't a scheduling conflict," I said, methodically pulling his clothes from dresser drawers and placing them in the suitcase. "This is a fundamental incompatibility in how we view marriage and partnership. You see me as someone who should adapt to your choices. I need someone who sees me as someone worth making choices for." The finality in my voice seemed to register with him for the first time. He sat heavily on the edge of our bed, watching me pack his belongings with growing alarm. Rachel, I love you. You know I love you. My work doesn't change that. Love isn't just a feeling, Derek. Love is a series of choices, a pattern of behavior, a commitment to prioritizing someone's well-being alongside your own. I folded his shirts with mechanical precision, focusing on the task to avoid looking at his face. You may feel love for me, but you don't love me with your actions. You don't love me with your time or your attention or your choices. That's not true. I work hard for us, for our future together. Everything I do is building toward a better life for both of us. I stopped packing and turned to face him. Everything you do is building toward a better life for you. I'm just expected to be grateful for whatever benefits trickle down from your success. I gestured around our expensive apartment, furnished with items Derek had chosen based on how they would impress his colleagues. Look around, Derek. This is your life, decorated with your preferences, organized around your schedule, designed to support your ambitions. Where am I in any of this, except as an accessory to your image? He opened his mouth to argue, then closed it again, perhaps finally seeing our living space through my eyes. The artwork he'd selected without consulting me. The furniture arranged to accommodate his home office needs. The social calendar built around his networking requirements. I'd become so accustomed to adapting to his choices that I'd stopped noticing how completely my own preferences had been erased. I never asked you to give up your own goals, he said weakly. You didn't have to ask. You just made it clear that your goals were more important, more urgent, more worthy of sacrifice and compromise, and I was foolish enough to believe that if I supported you long enough, eventually you'd return the favor. Derek's phone buzzed with what was undoubtedly another message from Victoria about the Detroit situation. He glanced at it reflexively, and that unconscious prioritization of her communication over our conversation told me everything I needed to know about where his true loyalties lay. Answer it, I said quietly. Handle whatever crisis she needs you to handle, but do it from somewhere else. He looked torn between responding to the message and continuing our conversation, but the pull of Victoria's demands proved stronger. Rachel, I have to take this. It's about the flight arrangements. I know you do, I replied, zipping up his suitcase. You always have to take her calls. That's exactly the problem. Derek spent 15 minutes on the phone with Victoria, discussing strategy for the Detroit meetings while I finished packing his belongings. When he finally hung up, he found me waiting by the front door with his luggage, my face set with a resolution that seemed to surprise him. Rachel, please, let's talk about this rationally when I get back. Don't make any permanent decisions while you're emotional. The condescending suggestion that my response was purely emotional rather than the result of months of careful observation infuriated me. I'm not emotional, Derek. I'm clear-headed for the first time in years. I'm seeing our relationship without the filter of hope that things will eventually change. Things can change. I can find a better balance once this Detroit situation is resolved, once I get more established with Victoria's team. Give me a chance to prove that. I studied his face, looking for any sign that he truly understood what I was telling him, any indication that he grasped the fundamental problems in our dynamic. Instead, I saw the same pattern that had defined our relationship, promises of future change that would never require him to sacrifice anything in the present, assurances that my needs would matter once his more pressing concerns were addressed. I've given you 3 years of chances, Derek. I've accommodated, adapted, and adjusted my life around your career trajectory. I've been patient while you established yourself, understanding while you built your reputation, supportive while you impressed your supervisors. But patience and understanding have expiration dates, and mine has passed. Derek's phone buzzed again, and I watched him struggle not to look at it. The fact that he had to struggle, that Victoria's messages pulled at his attention even during the most serious conversation our marriage had ever faced, reinforced every point I'd been trying to make. Look at your phone, I said. Check her message. See what she needs now. Rachel, no, this conversation is more important. Check it, Derek, because we both know you want to, and we both know you'll be distracted until you do. And that distraction, that constant pull of her needs over mine, is why this marriage doesn't work anymore. Reluctantly, he glanced at his phone, and I saw his expression shift as he read Victoria's latest demand. Whatever she needed was urgent, time-sensitive, requiring his immediate attention and expertise, just like always. She needs me to review the contract amendments before the morning meeting, he said apologetically. It'll just take a few minutes. No, Derek, it won't take a few minutes. It'll take however long Victoria needs it to take, and then there will be another urgent task, and another, and I'll continue to wait for my turn to matter in your life, a turn that never actually comes. I opened our front door and gestured toward the hallway. Go to Detroit. Save the account, be the hero Victoria needs you to be. But don't expect me to continue playing the role of the understanding wife who's always fine with being second choice. Derek picked up his bags reluctantly, still seeming to believe that this was a temporary arrangement, a cooling-off period that would end with my usual accommodation to his choices. I'll call you when I land. We can figure this out, Rachel. We've been together too long to throw it all away over work stress. This isn't work stress, Derek. This is who you are. This is who we are together. And I've finally realized that I deserve better than a marriage where I'm constantly competing with your boss for your attention and losing. After he left, I stood in our suddenly quiet apartment and felt the strangest mixture of grief and relief. The silence felt different than the usual quiet of Derek working late or traveling for business. This silence belonged to me, reflected my choices, offered space for my thoughts without the constant background hum of his career demands. I called my firm and left a message that I'd be attending the showcase alone, then changed into my most confident professional outfit and went to represent my work with pride. For the first time in months, I spoke about my design projects with genuine enthusiasm, networking with other professionals who shared my passion for sustainable innovation. Several people expressed interest in collaborating on future projects, and I found myself exchanging business cards and making tentative plans for creative partnerships. The evening was successful in ways I hadn't anticipated. Without Derek's subtle redirections toward his own accomplishments, without his tendency to position himself as the more serious professional in our relationship, I was able to present myself authentically as a skilled designer with valuable expertise. The recognition felt earned rather than grudgingly granted, meaningful rather than obligatory. When I returned home that night, I didn't feel the usual emptiness of Derek's absence. Instead, I felt curious about what other aspects of my life might flourish if given space to grow without the constant shadow of his priorities. I pulled out my old design portfolios, projects I'd completed before learning to dim my enthusiasm to avoid overshadowing Derek's achievements, and remembered the woman I'd been before I'd taught myself to be smaller. Derek called from Detroit the next morning, his voice strained with exhaustion and stress. The meetings with the Hartwell Group were going poorly. Victoria was demanding round-the-clock availability, and he needed to extend his trip indefinitely to salvage the account. He spoke about his situation as if I would naturally sympathize with his difficulties, as if my role was to provide emotional support while he navigated his professional challenges. "I miss you," he said near the end of the call. "This whole situation has made me realize how much I depend on you being there when I come home." The phrasing struck me as particularly revealing. He missed having me available when he needed emotional support, but there was no acknowledgement of what I might need from him, no recognition that his extended absence meant I was handling everything alone once again. Even his expression of missing me centered his needs rather than recognizing mine. "Take care of yourself, Derek," I said simply. "Focus on what Victoria needs you to focus on. When I get back, we'll sit down and really talk about finding better balance. Maybe we can plan a vacation, just the two of us, somewhere without cell service." The promise felt as hollow as all the others he'd made over the years. A vacation would be lovely, but it wouldn't address the fundamental issue that his career would always take precedence over our relationship, that Victoria's needs would always be more urgent than mine, that my role would always be to accommodate rather than to be accommodated. After hanging up, I made a decision that surprised me with its clarity. I wouldn't wait for Derek to return and renegotiate our relationship dynamic. I wouldn't hope for changes that would require him to fundamentally alter his priorities and behavior patterns. Instead, I would use this time apart to rediscover who I was independent of his ambitions and expectations. I started by rearranging our apartment, moving furniture to create space for a proper design studio in what had been Derek's secondary office area. I set up a drafting table, organized my art supplies, and created a workspace that reflected my aesthetic preferences rather than his corporate image requirements. The physical act of claiming space for my own creative work felt revolutionary after years of subordinating my needs to his. Next, I reached out to former colleagues and mentors in the design world, people I'd gradually lost touch with as Derek's social and professional networks had taken precedence. I scheduled coffee meetings, attended industry events I'd previously skipped to accommodate Derek's schedule, and began rebuilding professional relationships I'd allowed to atrophy. The response was overwhelmingly positive. People remembered my work fondly, expressed surprise that I'd been so quiet professionally, and offered opportunities for collaboration and growth that I hadn't realized were available. One conversation led to another, and within a week I had 3 potential freelance projects and an invitation to submit a proposal for a major sustainable housing development. As I threw myself into creative work with an intensity I hadn't felt in years, I began to understand how much of myself I'd lost in the process of supporting Derek's ambitions. My design skills had remained sharp, but my confidence had eroded under years of being treated as the secondary professional in our household. My creativity had survived, but my willingness to take risks and pursue challenging projects had been diminished by Derek's subtle messaging that my career was less important than his. Most significantly, I began to remember what it felt like to be excited about my own future rather than anxiously managing someone else's. For the first time in years, I fell asleep thinking about my own projects and goals, rather than worrying about Derek's stress levels or planning ways to support his next career move. The shift in focus felt both foreign and liberating, like rediscovering a language I'd once spoken fluently but had gradually forgotten. 2 weeks into Derek's extended Detroit assignment, I received an offer that would change everything. Maria Santos, a developer I'd worked with early in my career, called with an unexpected proposition. She was expanding her sustainable housing company into Vermont, developing eco-friendly mountain retreats for urban professionals seeking authentic connection with nature. She needed a lead designer who understood both environmental sustainability and luxury aesthetics, someone who could create spaces that felt both rustic and refined. "I've been following your recent work, Rachel," Maria explained during our video call. "Your office renovation project shows exactly the kind of innovative thinking we need. Plus, you understand the high-end market we're targeting. The position would be based in Millbrook, Vermont, but it comes with significant creative freedom and an equity stake in the Vermont operation." Millbrook, Vermont. I'd never heard of the town, but when I researched it online, I found a small mountain community surrounded by forests and farmland, the kind of place where people prioritized quality of life over career advancement, where success was measured by different standards than the ones that governed Derek's world. The offer represented everything I'd once dreamed of professionally: creative leadership, environmental focus, financial growth potential, and geographic independence from the corporate culture that had gradually consumed my life in Chicago. It was also a complete departure from the life Derek and I had built together, incompatible with his career trajectory and social ambitions. As I researched Millbrook and considered Maria's offer, I felt a stirring of excitement I hadn't experienced in years. The possibility of starting fresh in a place where my professional identity wouldn't be overshadowed by Derek's achievements, where I could pursue my own vision without constantly accommodating someone else's priorities, felt like a gift I hadn't dared to hope for. Derek called that evening, full of updates about the Detroit situation and news that Victoria was so impressed with his crisis management that she was considering him for a senior position that would require even more travel and client management. He spoke about this potential promotion as an unqualified positive development, seemingly unaware that it would mean even less time for our relationship, even greater demands on his availability. "The best part is that the new role would come with a significant salary increase," he said excitedly. "We could finally afford that house in Lincoln Park we looked at last year, maybe start thinking about expanding our family." The casual assumption that I would want to expand our family while he expanded his career responsibilities, the expectation that a larger house would compensate for an increasingly absent husband, revealed how little he understood about what I actually needed for happiness and fulfillment. "Derek," I said carefully, "I need to tell you about an opportunity I've been offered." I explained Maria's proposition, the Vermont position, the chance to lead a significant sustainable design initiative in a setting that aligned with my personal and professional values. I spoke about the creative freedom, the environmental mission, the opportunity to build something meaningful from the ground up. Derek's response was immediate and dismissive. "Vermont? Rachel, that's basically career suicide. What kind of serious design work could possibly be happening in some rural mountain town? You'd be throwing away everything we've built here for what, some hippie housing project?" The casual cruelty of his assessment, the automatic assumption that anything outside his urban corporate world was inherently less valuable, crystallized the fundamental incompatibility between our worldviews. Derek measured worth by prestige and salary figures. I was increasingly drawn to meaning and creative fulfillment. He saw Vermont as professional exile. I saw it as professional liberation. "I haven't decided anything yet," I said, though even as I spoke the words I realized that wasn't entirely true. Something inside me had already begun to shift toward this new possibility, toward a life where my choices mattered as much as his. Good, because it would be completely irrational to consider leaving Chicago just when my career is really taking off. Victoria has hinted that there might be partnership opportunities within the next few years. We're finally getting to where we've worked so hard to reach. The phrase "where we've worked so hard to reach" encapsulated everything wrong with our dynamic. Derek had worked hard to reach this point in his career. I had worked hard to support his work, to accommodate his schedule, to maintain the domestic and social infrastructure that allowed him to focus entirely on professional advancement. But we hadn't built something together. I had simply facilitated his individual achievement. "Maybe what you've worked to reach isn't what I want anymore," I said quietly. The silence on the other end of the phone stretched long enough that I wondered if the call had dropped. When Derek finally spoke, his voice carried a note of panic I'd rarely heard before. "Rachel, what are you saying? Are you threatening to leave me if I don't support this Vermont idea? Because that seems like emotional manipulation." The accusation of manipulation, coming from someone who had manipulated my choices for years through guilt and dismissiveness, was so absurd that I almost laughed. "I'm not threatening anything, Derek. I'm simply telling you that I'm considering an opportunity that would allow me to grow professionally and personally in ways that our current life doesn't permit." "Our current life is good," he insisted. "We have financial security, social status, professional respect. Why would you want to throw that away for uncertainty?" "Our current life is good for you," I corrected. "It's designed around your preferences, your career needs, your definition of success. I've been living as a supporting character in your story for so long that I'd forgotten I was supposed to be the protagonist of my own." The conversation ended without resolution, Derek promising to cut his Detroit trip short so we could discuss this face-to-face, me suggesting that perhaps extended conversation wasn't what our relationship needed. As I hung up, I felt the weight of a decision that was no longer a decision. Derek's response to Maria's offer had revealed everything I needed to know about how he viewed my autonomy and aspirations. I called Maria the next morning and accepted her offer, asking for 2 weeks to relocate and begin the transition. Then I spent the day researching Millbrook, Vermont, imagining a life where I could walk to work through mountain forests, where my creative energy would be channeled into projects that reflected my values, where my success would be measured by my own standards rather than by how well I supported someone else's ambitions. For the first time in years, I fell asleep excited about my future rather than anxious about managing someone else's. The woman who had always been fine was finally choosing to be more than fine. She was choosing to be free. The moving truck disappeared down the winding mountain road, leaving me standing in front of a rustic cabin that would serve as both my temporary home and my introduction to Vermont living. The silence was profound, broken only by the rustling of maple leaves and the distant sound of a creek that ran behind the property. After years of Chicago's constant urban hum, the quiet felt almost overwhelming, like stepping into a different world entirely. Maria had arranged for me to rent the cabin from Frank and Helen Kowalski, a retired couple who owned a furniture workshop down the road. The cabin itself was charming in a way that Derek would have dismissed as quaint, with hand-hewn beams, a stone fireplace, and windows that framed views of the surrounding forest like living artwork. It was the antithesis of our sleek Chicago apartment, all natural materials and organic lines instead of glass and steel, and carefully curated minimalism. I carried my boxes inside one by one, each trip revealing more of the cabin's character. The floors were wide plank pine that creaked pleasantly underfoot, worn smooth by decades of use. The kitchen was compact but functional, with open shelving displaying an eclectic collection of handmade pottery that the Kowalskis had left for my use. Everything about the space spoke of craftsmanship and authenticity, values that had been gradually squeezed out of my life in pursuit of Derek's version of success. As I unpacked my design supplies and set up a workspace at the kitchen table, I felt a strange combination of excitement and vertigo. For the first time in years, I was making decisions based entirely on my own preferences, arranging my living space to support my work and comfort rather than to impress Derek's colleagues or accommodate his home office needs. The freedom was intoxicating and terrifying in equal measure. My phone had been mercifully quiet during the move, Derek apparently too busy with Victoria's Detroit crisis to check in on my relocation progress, I'd left him a brief message explaining that I was taking the Vermont position and would be staying in Millbrook for the foreseeable future, but I hadn't provided details about my living situation or timeline for potential return. The ambiguity was intentional. I needed space to discover who I was when I wasn't constantly adapting to someone else's expectations. The next morning, I drove to the Kowalski workshop for my first official introduction to my new neighbors. Frank Kowalski turned out to be a bear of a man with calloused hands and kind eyes, someone who seemed to measure worth by the quality of work produced rather than by salary figures or social connections. His wife Helen was equally welcoming, immediately offering me coffee and homemade muffins while Frank showed me around their operation. The workshop was a revelation. Frank specialized in custom furniture made from locally sourced wood, pieces that would last for generations rather than following fleeting design trends. His workbenches were organized with the precision of someone who understood that good tools and proper care were essential for quality craftsmanship. Helen handled the business side, managing orders and client relationships with the same attention to detail that Frank brought to his woodworking. "Maria mentioned you're working on the mountain retreat project," Helen said as we sat in their kitchen, warming our hands around ceramic mugs. "That's exciting news for Millbrook. We've been hoping someone would finally develop those properties in a way that respects the landscape." I found myself explaining my vision for the retreat center, my commitment to sustainable building practices and integration with the natural environment. Frank listened with the intensity of someone genuinely interested in craftsmanship and environmental stewardship, asking thoughtful questions about materials and construction techniques. It was the first professional conversation I'd had in years where I wasn't subtly positioning myself as secondary to Derek's expertise. "Would you be interested in collaborating on some custom pieces?" Frank asked. "I've been wanting to work with a designer who understands both aesthetics and sustainability. Most of the projects I get are either purely functional or purely decorative, but what you're describing sounds like it could be both." The invitation to collaborate caught me off guard. In Chicago, my role had gradually become limited to supporting Derek's projects rather than leading my own initiatives. Here was Frank, a master craftsman, treating me as an equal partner in creative endeavor based on nothing more than our shared conversation about design philosophy and environmental responsibility. "I'd love that," I heard myself saying, and realized it was the first time in months I'd committed to something with genuine enthusiasm rather than dutiful obligation. Over the following weeks, I threw myself into the retreat project with an energy I'd forgotten I possessed. The property Maria had acquired consisted of 40 acres of mixed forest and meadow, with a small pond and spectacular views of the surrounding mountains. My job was to design a series of small cabins that would provide luxury accommodations while maintaining the site's natural character and minimizing environmental impact. I spent hours walking the property, studying how light moved through the trees at different times of day, observing where water naturally flowed during rain, noting which areas felt most sheltered and which offered the best views. This kind of site analysis had been my favorite part of design school, but it had been years since I'd worked on a project that allowed such deep integration with the landscape. The design process felt like rediscovering a language I'd once spoken fluently. I sketched cabin layouts that would nestle into the topography rather than dominating it, planned walking trails that would reveal the property's beauty gradually rather than all at once, designed gathering spaces that would encourage both solitude and community depending on guests' needs. Each decision was based on careful observation of the site's unique characteristics rather than generic luxury standards. Frank proved to be an invaluable collaborator, his knowledge of local wood species and traditional building techniques adding depth to my environmental goals. He taught me about the different properties of maple versus oak, about how to select lumber that would age gracefully in Vermont's climate, about construction methods that had sustained buildings in harsh winters for over a century. "Store-bought furniture looks the same everywhere," he explained one afternoon as we examined samples of locally milled pine. "But when you use materials from the place where something will live, it belongs there in a way that factory pieces never can. The wood knows the climate, understands the seasonal changes, settles into the environment like it was always meant to be there." His philosophy resonated with something I'd been feeling but hadn't been able to articulate. In Chicago, I'd been like store-bought furniture, technically functional but never quite belonging, always slightly out of place in Derek's carefully curated life. Here in Vermont, working with materials and methods that had deep roots in the landscape, I was beginning to feel like I might actually belong somewhere. Helen became equally important to my integration into Millbrook's community. She introduced me to other local business owners, invited me to town meetings where residents discussed everything from snow removal to summer festival planning, and included me in the informal network of women who seemed to run most of the community's social infrastructure. These women were accomplished in ways that Derek's Chicago social circle would never have recognized as significant, but their competence and leadership were undeniable. Amy Chen ran the town's only bookstore, but she also organized the farmers market, coordinated volunteer efforts for elderly residents, and somehow found time to teach evening literacy classes for adults who'd missed educational opportunities earlier in life. Lisa Rodriguez managed the credit union that served 3 small towns, using her financial expertise to help local businesses secure loans and navigate economic challenges that larger banks ignored. These women measured success by their contributions to community well-being, rather than by individual accumulation of wealth or status. Through Helen's introductions, I began to understand Millbrook's economic ecosystem and my potential place within it. The town survived on a combination of small-scale agriculture, artisan crafts, outdoor recreation, and the growing trend of urban professionals seeking rural retreats. My retreat project fit naturally into this economy, providing employment for local contractors and suppliers while attracting visitors who would support other businesses in town. More importantly, I discovered that my design skills were genuinely valued in ways that went beyond the retreat project. Joseph Kim, who owned the town's auto repair shop, asked me to help him reorganize his workspace for better efficiency and safety. Lisa Rodriguez wanted advice on making the credit union's lobby more welcoming and accessible. Amy Chen dreamed of expanding her bookstore to include a coffee shop and community meeting space, but wasn't sure how to design the renovation. Each of these projects was small by Chicago standards, offering modest compensation and no prestige value for my professional portfolio, but they were deeply satisfying in ways I hadn't anticipated. My suggestions made real improvements to people's daily work lives. My designs helped local businesses serve their communities more effectively, and my expertise was treated as valuable rather than supplementary to someone else's more important contributions. The physical demands of Vermont living also began to change me in unexpected ways. In Chicago, I'd maintained my fitness through expensive gym memberships and carefully scheduled workout classes, treating exercise as another item to check off my daily productivity list. Here, physical activity was integrated into daily life through practical necessity and natural opportunity. My cabin was heated primarily by a wood stove, which meant learning to split firewood and maintain consistent heat through careful feeding and banking of coals. The process was initially frustrating and inefficient, but Frank patiently taught me the techniques his grandfather had passed down to him. Soon I found myself looking forward to the evening ritual of preparing the stove for overnight burning, appreciating the immediate cause and effect relationship between my efforts and my comfort. Walking became my primary form of transportation within Millbrook, and hiking emerged as both recreation and professional necessity as I explored the retreat property. My body adapted to the constant low-level physical activity, developing a functional strength that felt more satisfying than the artificial challenges of gym equipment. My hands, once carefully maintained for professional appearances, developed calluses from splitting wood and handling tools, marks that I began to view as evidence of capability rather than flaws to be hidden. Most significantly, my relationship with time began to shift in fundamental ways. In Chicago, my schedule had been dictated by Derek's meetings, his travel requirements, his need for domestic support during stressful periods. Even my personal time had been structured around his availability and preferences. Here in Vermont, I discovered the luxury of following natural rhythms rather than artificial deadlines. I woke with the sunrise and went to bed not long after sunset, my body automatically adjusting to seasonal changes in daylight rather than fighting them with artificial lighting and caffeine. I ate when I was hungry rather than when it was convenient for Derek's schedule, cooked with ingredients that reflected what was seasonally available rather than what impressed dinner party guests. The retreat project had its own timeline, of course, but it was based on construction realities and weather patterns rather than arbitrary corporate pressures. If a day was particularly beautiful, I might spend extra time outdoors studying the property instead of rushing back to my computer. If inspiration struck for solving a design challenge, I could work late into the evening without worrying about disturbing someone else's sleep or neglecting domestic responsibilities. This flexibility allowed my creativity to flourish in ways it hadn't for years. Design solutions emerged organically from careful observation and patient consideration, rather than being forced through deadline pressure and client demands. The cabins I was designing for the retreat felt authentically connected to their site because I had time to understand that site deeply, to notice subtleties that would have been invisible under the rushed timeline pressures of urban projects. 6 weeks into my Vermont residency, Derek finally made contact beyond our brief and increasingly infrequent text exchanges. His call came on a Thursday evening as I was preparing dinner in my cabin kitchen, the fire crackling pleasantly in the background and rain pattering against the windows. The domestic tranquility of the moment made his urban stress palpable even through the phone connection. "Rachel, this has gone on long enough," he announced without preamble. "Victoria's finally wrapping up the Detroit situation, and I need you to come back to Chicago. We have the Henderson anniversary party next weekend, and I can't attend alone. People are starting to ask questions about where you are." The casual assumption that I would return to fulfill my role as his social accessory, the complete lack of interest in how I was doing or what I was accomplishing, crystallized how little our time apart had changed his fundamental perspective on our relationship. In his mind, I'd been having an extended vacation or perhaps a minor breakdown, something to be tolerated temporarily but ultimately corrected through his decisive intervention. "I'm not coming back for the Henderson party," I said calmly. "I have work commitments here that I can't abandon." "Work commitments?" Derek's voice carried the same dismissive tone he'd used when discussing my design career throughout our marriage. "Rachel, whatever hobby projects you're pursuing in Vermont can't be more important than maintaining our professional relationships in Chicago. The Hendersons are potential clients for Morrison Associates. My presence at their party with you beside me is literally an investment in my career advancement." The phrase hobby projects applied to my leadership role in a significant development initiative revealed how little he'd bothered to understand what I was actually doing. More tellingly, his description of my role as ornamental support for his networking efforts, someone whose value was measured by how well I enhanced his professional image, showed that our time apart hadn't prompted any reflection on the dynamics that had driven me away. "My work here isn't a hobby, Derek. I'm the lead designer on a major sustainable housing project. I'm collaborating with local artisans on custom furniture pieces, and I'm providing design consultation for several small businesses in town. These are professional commitments with real financial and creative stakes." "Fine, whatever you want to call it," Derek said impatiently. "But surely you can take a weekend break to attend an important social event with your husband. I'm not asking you to abandon your Vermont adventure permanently, just to prioritize our marriage occasionally." The characterization of our separation as my Vermont adventure and his demand that I prioritize our marriage by serving his career needs revealed the fundamental misunderstanding that made reconciliation impossible. Derek still saw my choices as temporary rebellion rather than genuine redirection, still believed that the right combination of pressure and persuasion would return me to my supporting role in his life story. "I am prioritizing our marriage, Derek. I'm prioritizing my own growth and happiness, which are essential components of any healthy partnership. What you're asking me to prioritize is your convenience and professional advancement, which isn't the same thing." The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, Derek cycling through various arguments designed to guilt, manipulate, or logic me into returning to Chicago for the weekend. He mentioned the money we'd spent on my education, the investments we'd made in our Chicago lifestyle, the expectations of mutual support that came with marriage vows. Each argument revealed his inability to see me as an individual with legitimate independent goals rather than as a partner whose primary function was facilitating his success. When I finally hung up, I felt more certain than ever that the life I was building in Vermont represented my authentic self in ways that my Chicago existence never had. Derek's call had served as a reminder of what I'd left behind rather than a temptation to return to it. That night, I sat by my fire and wrote in the journal I'd started keeping since arriving in Vermont. The practice of daily reflection had emerged naturally from the slower pace of life and the profound changes I was experiencing. Writing helped me process the disorientation of rebuilding my identity around my own choices rather than someone else's expectations. "I realized tonight that Derek still sees me as the woman who left Chicago 3 months ago," I wrote. "He doesn't understand that person no longer exists. The woman who would drop everything to serve as his social accessory has been replaced by someone who values her own work too much to abandon it for his convenience. The woman who measured her worth by how well she supported his ambitions has discovered her own ambitions and found them worthy of protection." Reading those words back to myself, I felt a deep sense of rightness that had been missing from my life for years. I was becoming someone I genuinely liked and respected, someone whose choices reflected her values rather than someone else's preferences. The process was sometimes lonely and often challenging, but it felt authentic in ways that my carefully constructed Chicago life never had. Winter was approaching, and Frank had warned me about the realities of Vermont cold for someone accustomed to centrally heated urban apartments. But I found myself looking forward to the season rather than dreading it. Winter would test my practical skills and physical resilience, but it would also offer the deep quiet and inward focus that seemed perfect for continuing my personal and professional development. I was no longer the woman who had been abandoned at a train station and defined that abandonment as her husband's poor judgment, rather than as liberation from a constraining relationship. I was becoming someone who made deliberate choices about where to live, and how to work, and whom to value. Someone whose life reflected her authentic priorities rather than adaptive compromises. The retreat project was progressing beautifully, with the first cabin scheduled to begin construction in the spring. Frank and I had developed a collaboration that felt truly equal, both of us contributing expertise that enhanced the final product. Helen had introduced me to potential investors who were excited about sustainable tourism opportunities in Vermont. Amy Chen had agreed to help me develop marketing materials that would attract the right kind of guests to the retreat. More importantly, I had developed a network of friendships based on mutual respect and shared values rather than social obligation and professional advancement. These people valued me for my contributions to their community rather than for my ability to enhance someone else's image. They were interested in my ideas and opinions, supportive of my professional growth, and genuinely concerned about my well-being in ways that felt both foreign and wonderful after years of Derek's benign neglect. As autumn deepened into winter, I prepared for my first Vermont Christmas with anticipation rather than anxiety. There would be no obligatory corporate parties to attend, no careful navigation of Derek's professional relationships, no exhausting performance of the perfect supportive wife. Instead, there would be community celebrations where my participation was welcomed but not required, where I could contribute my authentic self rather than a carefully curated version designed to reflect well on my husband. I was finally living a life that belonged to me, shaped by my choices and reflecting my values. The woman who had always been fine was discovering what it meant to be genuinely happy, fulfilled, and free to become whoever she was meant to be without the constraints of someone else's limited vision of her potential. Spring arrived in Vermont with an explosion of activity that matched my own professional momentum. The retreat center had gained attention from architectural magazines and sustainable living publications, with 3 major features scheduled for summer publication. What had started as a local development project was becoming a model for environmentally conscious luxury hospitality, attracting interest from investors and developers across New England. Maria arrived from Chicago in early May to review our progress, and her amazement at what we'd accomplished in less than a year was deeply satisfying. The first cabin was nearing completion, a stunning example of how modern comfort could coexist harmoniously with natural materials and environmental stewardship. Frank's custom furniture pieces were receiving advance orders from guests who hadn't even stayed at the retreat yet, simply based on photographs and word-of-mouth recommendations. "Rachel, this is beyond what I imagined when I offered you the position," Maria said as we walked through the nearly finished cabin. "You've created something that's both commercially viable and environmentally revolutionary. I've had calls from developers in 3 states asking if you'd consult on similar projects." The consulting requests represented a turning point I hadn't anticipated. My work in Vermont was generating opportunities that could establish me as a national expert in sustainable luxury design, a niche that combined my environmental values with high-end aesthetics in ways that the market was increasingly demanding. Each inquiry came with project budgets that dwarfed what I'd earned in Chicago, along with creative freedom that Derek's corporate world had never offered. Carlos Mendoza, a developer from Burlington who specialized in ecotourism ventures, became my first major consulting client. His project involved converting a defunct ski resort into a year-round sustainable recreation center, complete with solar-powered lodge facilities and trail systems designed to minimize environmental impact. The scope was ambitious, the timeline challenging, and the fee structure more generous than any project I'd worked on in my previous career. "I've been following your work since the first retreat center articles came out," Carlos explained during our initial meeting. "What you've achieved in Millbrook shows exactly the kind of vision we need for this project. We want someone who understands that luxury doesn't have to mean environmental destruction, someone who can create experiences that make guests feel more connected to nature rather than isolated from it. Working with Carlos required expanding my team and formalizing my business structure in ways that felt both exciting and daunting. I hired 2 junior designers from sustainable architecture programs, recent graduates who brought fresh energy and cutting-edge technical knowledge to complement my growing expertise in eco-luxury design. Helen Kowalski agreed to manage the administrative aspects of my expanding practice, her decades of small business experience proving invaluable as we navigated contracts and project management systems. The success brought unexpected challenges, particularly in terms of time management and geographical logistics. Consulting projects required travel to sites across Vermont, New Hampshire, and upstate New York, pulling me away from the quiet routines that had become central to my well-being. I found myself struggling to maintain the work-life balance that had been one of Vermont's greatest gifts, caught between the excitement of professional growth and the risk of recreating the stress patterns I'd escaped by leaving Chicago. Frank noticed my increasing tension during one of our weekly collaboration sessions. "Success is supposed to make you happier, not more frazzled," he observed as I rushed through reviewing furniture specifications for 3 different projects. "Maybe it's time to think about what you really want from all this opportunity." His question forced me to confront an uncomfortable truth. I was becoming successful by conventional measures, earning more money than I'd ever made, and gaining recognition in my field that exceeded anything I'd achieved in Chicago. But the pace and pressure were beginning to feel familiar in troubling ways, reminiscent of the career-focused lifestyle that had contributed to my marital problems with Derek. The difference, I realized, was that this success belonged entirely to me. Every decision about which projects to accept, how to structure my business, and where to focus my creative energy was mine to make without consulting anyone else's preferences or accommodating anyone else's timeline. The stress was real, but it was stress in service of my own goals rather than someone else's ambitions. I made the conscious decision to be selective about new opportunities, accepting only projects that aligned with my environmental values and offered sufficient creative freedom to justify the time investment. This approach meant turning down some lucrative offers, but it preserved the autonomy and authenticity that had been the real gifts of my Vermont transformation. Amy Chen proved instrumental in helping me navigate this balance. Her bookstore had become an unofficial community center where local business owners gathered to share challenges and celebrate successes. Through conversations with other entrepreneurs who had built sustainable enterprises in rural Vermont, I learned strategies for growth that preserved personal values and community connections. The mistake a lot of people make when their business takes off is thinking they have to say yes to everything. Amy explained one evening as we sat in her shop after closing time. But saying yes to the wrong opportunities is just another way of losing control over your own life. The goal isn't to become as busy as possible, it's to become as purposeful as possible. Her wisdom helped me develop criteria for evaluating new opportunities that went beyond financial considerations. I began asking whether each potential project would enhance my expertise in areas I cared about, whether it would allow me to work with people whose values aligned with mine, and whether it would contribute to the kind of world I wanted to help create through my design work. This selective approach led to some of my most meaningful professional relationships. I collaborated with Indigenous architects on a tribal community center that honored traditional building practices while incorporating modern sustainability techniques. I worked with a women's cooperative in New Hampshire to design affordable housing that would allow elderly residents to age in place while maintaining community connections. Each project expanded my understanding of how design could serve social and environmental justice rather than simply creating beautiful spaces for wealthy clients. The financial success of my practice also allowed me to invest in my personal living situation in ways that reflected my evolving relationship with home and belonging. I purchased the cabin I'd been renting from Frank and Helen, then collaborated with Frank to design and build a proper design studio as an addition to the property. The studio became a showcase for our collaborative approach, featuring custom furniture pieces that demonstrated how locally sourced materials could be crafted into functional art. More significantly, I began hosting design workshops and sustainability seminars at the retreat center, sharing knowledge I'd gained with other professionals who were interested in environmental approaches to luxury hospitality. These events attracted participants from across the country, creating a network of like-minded designers and developers who supported each other's work and shared resources for advancing sustainable practices in the industry. The workshops also reconnected me with my love of teaching, something I'd set aside years earlier when Derek's career had taken priority over my own professional development. Leading sessions on site analysis, Material selection and client communication reminded me how much I enjoyed mentoring emerging professionals and contributing to the evolution of design practices toward greater environmental responsibility. One particularly memorable workshop participant was Jennifer Walsh, a young designer from Boston who was struggling to maintain her environmental values while working for a firm that prioritized profit margins over sustainable practices. Her situation reminded me of my own compromises during the years when Derek's career had overshadowed my professional development, and I found myself offering guidance that went beyond technical design skills. The hardest part is feeling like you have to choose between making a living and staying true to your values, Jennifer confided during a break between sessions. Everyone says there's no market for truly sustainable luxury design, that clients won't pay premium prices for environmental responsibility. Everyone is wrong, I replied, gesturing toward the retreat center where we were meeting. There's absolutely a market for sustainable luxury, but it requires educating clients about why environmental responsibility enhances rather than compromises their experience. Most people want to feel good about their choices. They just need help understanding how sustainability can align with their desires for beauty and comfort. My conversation with Jennifer sparked an idea that would become another important dimension of my evolving practice. I began developing educational materials for clients and other designers about the business case for sustainable luxury design, demonstrating how environmental stewardship could enhance project outcomes rather than limiting them. These materials evolved into a series of online courses and eventually a book proposal that attracted interest from publishers specializing in professional development content. The book project, tentatively titled Designing with Nature: A Guide to Sustainable Luxury, represented a new frontier in my professional development. Writing required synthesizing everything I'd learned about balancing environmental responsibility with aesthetic excellence, about building client relationships based on shared values rather than purely financial considerations, and about creating design practices that sustained both the practitioner and the environment over the long term. Working on the book also prompted deeper reflection on my personal journey from corporate wife to independent entrepreneur. The contrast between my current life and my previous existence in Chicago felt so dramatic that it sometimes seemed like I was writing about a different person entirely. The woman who had accommodated Derek's schedule and prioritized his career advancement bore little resemblance to the confident professional who now turned down projects that didn't align with her values and designed her own life around her own priorities. This transformation became particularly apparent when Derek finally decided to visit Vermont in late summer, almost a year after I'd left Chicago. His call announcing his intention to drive up for a weekend caught me off guard. Not because I'd forgotten about our unresolved relationship status, but because his existence had become so peripheral to my daily reality that his reappearance felt like an intrusion from a previous life. "I think it's time we had a proper conversation about our future," Derek announced during his call. "I've been patient with your Vermont experiment, but we need to make some decisions about our marriage and our life together. I'm willing to discuss some compromises if you're ready to be reasonable about returning to Chicago." The patronizing tone, the characterization of my successful business as an experiment, and the assumption that compromise meant my return to accommodate his preferences revealed how little our time apart had changed his fundamental perspective on our relationship. In his mind, I was still the woman who would eventually come to her senses and resume my supporting role in his life story. "You're welcome to visit, Derek," I said carefully, "but I want you to understand that I'm not interested in returning to Chicago or resuming our old relationship dynamic. I'm happy to show you what I've built here and explain how my life has changed, but I'm not open to negotiating my return to a situation that wasn't working for either of us." Derek's confidence that he could persuade me to return was evident in his response. "Rachel, I understand that you've enjoyed this break from responsibility, but we both know that your Vermont situation isn't sustainable long-term. You can't build a serious career in some rural mountain town. Let me come up and we'll figure out how to transition you back to real life in a way that addresses whatever concerns drove you away in the first place." The dismissive reference to my award-winning, nationally recognized design practice as something other than a serious career crystallized the impossibility of bridging the gap between Derek's worldview and my current reality. He literally could not comprehend that I had built something valuable outside his urban corporate framework, could not imagine that I might prefer my current life to the one we'd shared in Chicago. I spent the week before Derek's visit preparing both practically and emotionally for what would likely be our final conversation as husband and wife. I arranged for him to stay at the retreat center's completed guest cabin. both to showcase my professional accomplishments and to maintain appropriate distance during what would undoubtedly be a difficult weekend. I also scheduled time with Amy Chen and Helen Kowalski, knowing I would need supportive friends nearby as I navigated the emotional complexity of confronting my past while protecting my present. The day Derek arrived, I was working in my studio when I heard an unfamiliar car engine struggling up the mountain road to my property. Through the window, I watched a sleek silver BMW navigate the final curve, looking as out of place against the forest backdrop as Derek would soon prove to be in my new world. The contrast between his expensive luxury vehicle and the pickup trucks and practical sedans that usually visited my property seemed symbolic of the broader incompatibility between our chosen lifestyles. Derek emerged from his car, wearing the kind of carefully casual outfit that signaled expensive taste to urban observers, but would mark him as obviously out of place to anyone familiar with rural Vermont. His designer hiking boots had clearly never touched actual dirt. His artfully distressed jeans cost more than most locals spent on a month's worth of work clothes, and his organic cotton t-shirt probably carried a price tag higher than the daily wage of many people in Millbrook. I walked out to greet him, conscious of my own transformation as I approached. My clothes were chosen for comfort and practicality rather than impression management. My hands bore the calluses of someone who regularly used tools and handled materials, and my demeanor carried the confidence of someone who had built a life that reflected her authentic values rather than someone else's expectations. Derek's expression as he took in my appearance revealed the shock of encountering someone who no longer conformed to his mental image of who I should be. The carefully maintained woman he'd left in Chicago had been replaced by someone who looked healthy, capable, and fundamentally at ease in ways that apparently unsettled him. "Rachel," he said, his voice carrying a note of uncertainty I'd rarely heard before, "you look different. Very different." "I am different," I replied simply. "Come inside. Let me show you what I've been working on." The tour of my studio and living space served as a tangible demonstration of how completely my life had changed. Derek examined my design work with the same analytical approach he brought to business problems, clearly struggling to reconcile the quality and scope of my projects with his preconceptions about rural professional opportunities. The evidence of my success was too substantial to dismiss, but too far outside his worldview to fully comprehend. "This is impressive work," he admitted grudgingly, as he studied renderings for the converted ski resort project. "I had no idea you were involved in projects of this scale. But surely you could do this kind of work from Chicago, with better clients and higher fees?" His inability to understand that I might prefer working with environmentally conscious clients over purely profit-driven ones, that I might value creative freedom over higher fees, that I might choose to live in Vermont because I loved it, rather than despite its limitations, revealed the fundamental gap between our values that no amount of conversation could bridge. "Derek," I said gently, "I'm not doing this work despite living in Vermont. I'm doing it because living in Vermont has allowed me to become the designer and the person I was always meant to be. This isn't a compromise or a temporary arrangement. This is the life I've chosen because it reflects who I actually am rather than who I thought I needed to be to support your ambitions." The conversation that followed lasted most of the evening and covered years of accumulated misunderstandings, resentments, and incompatible expectations. Derek genuinely seemed to believe that our problems could be solved through better communication and more structured compromise, as if our fundamental differences were matters of logistics rather than core values. He proposed arrangements that would allow me to maintain some Vermont projects while returning to Chicago, schedules that would give me more independence while preserving our social and professional connections, financial structures that would treat my work as more equal to his, while maintaining his ultimate authority over our major life decisions. Each proposal revealed his continued inability to see me as an independent person with legitimate preferences that might conflict with his own. In his mind, I was still someone whose role was to adapt to his choices rather than someone whose choices deserved equal consideration. The year of separation hadn't prompted any fundamental reassessment of his priorities or behavior patterns. He'd simply developed more sophisticated arguments for why I should return to accommodating them. As the evening wore on, and Derek realized that his persuasion attempts weren't working, his tone shifted from confident negotiation to frustrated accusation. "I was being selfish," he claimed, "prioritizing my personal whims over our marriage commitment. I was being unrealistic about the long-term viability of my Vermont business. I was throwing away everything we'd built together for a lifestyle that would ultimately leave me isolated and professionally marginalized." "You're choosing trees and mountains over a real life with real opportunities," he said finally, his voice carrying the kind of dismissive certainty that had characterized too many of our conversations over the years. When this rural fantasy loses its novelty, when you realize what you've given up for the sake of playing house in the woods, it'll be too late to rebuild what we had in Chicago. His words crystallized everything that was wrong with his perspective and everything that was right with my choices. Derek saw my love for Vermont's landscape as superficial preference rather than genuine compatibility with my values. He saw my professional success as temporary novelty rather than sustainable accomplishment. He saw my happiness and fulfillment as illusion rather than the natural result of finally living authentically. "You're right that I'll never be able to rebuild what we had in Chicago," I replied calmly. "But that's because I don't want to rebuild it. What we had in Chicago wasn't working for me, Derek. It wasn't making me happy or helping me grow or allowing me to contribute my best work to the world. What I have here does all of those things." Derek left the next morning without the reconciliation he'd expected, without the compromise he'd been willing to negotiate, and without any real understanding of who I'd become during our year apart. As I watched his BMW disappear down the mountain road, I felt a profound sense of closure rather than loss. The woman who had once defined herself through his approval was gone, replaced by someone who knew her own worth and wouldn't compromise her authentic self for anyone else's comfort or convenience. That afternoon, I called my lawyer to begin divorce proceedings, ready to officially end a marriage that had ended emotionally long before Derek's visit. I was finally free to build a future that belonged entirely to me, shaped by my own choices and reflecting my own values without the constant negotiation and accommodation that had defined my previous life. The gold-plated car that would eventually carry me back to confront Derek was still months away, but the transformation that would make that moment possible was already complete. I had become someone who chose her own path and valued her own judgment, someone who had discovered what it meant to live according to her authentic priorities rather than someone else's expectations. The woman Derek had abandoned at a train station had used that abandonment as the first step toward a life of unprecedented freedom and fulfillment. 2 years after Derek's failed reconciliation visit, I received an invitation that would bring my transformation full circle. The National Sustainable Design Awards ceremony was being held in Chicago, and my retreat center project had been nominated for the Innovation in Eco-Luxury category. More significantly, I'd been invited to deliver the keynote address on redefining success in environmental design, a recognition that positioned me as a thought leader in my field. The irony wasn't lost on me that my triumphant return to Chicago would be professional rather than personal, based on achievements Derek had dismissed as rural fantasies when he'd visited Vermont. The ceremony would be held at the Palmer House, the same luxury hotel where Derek and I had attended countless corporate events during our marriage, where I'd smiled politely while he networked with clients and colleagues who treated me as decorative rather than substantive. My assistant, Jennifer Walsh, had relocated from Boston to Vermont 6 months earlier to help manage my expanding practice. She accompanied me to Chicago, marveling at the contrast between my current confidence and the stories I'd shared about my previous life in the city. Jennifer had become more than an employee. She was proof that the mentoring aspect of my work was creating meaningful change in other women's careers, as well as my own. "I can't imagine you as the accommodating wife you've described," Jennifer said, as our train approached Union Station. "The woman I know wouldn't compromise her vision for anyone's convenience, let alone suppress her professional ambitions to support someone else's ego." Her observation highlighted how completely I'd transformed, not just in circumstances but in fundamental character. The woman who had been abandoned at this very train station 3 years earlier had used that abandonment as liberation rather than devastation, building a life that exceeded anything she could have imagined while trapped in an accommodating marriage. The Palmer House lobby buzzed with sustainable design professionals from across the country, people whose work I'd followed and admired for years. Several approached me with genuine enthusiasm, praising my published articles and expressing interest in collaboration opportunities. The respect was authentic, based on my contributions to the field rather than my role as someone's spouse. Carlos Mendoza had flown in from Burlington for the ceremony, bringing news that our converted ski resort project was being featured in Architectural Digest's upcoming sustainability issue. Frank and Helen Kowalski had insisted on attending as well, proud of how their collaboration with me had evolved into a nationally recognized partnership between design innovation and traditional craftsmanship. "You've created something special up there in Vermont," Frank told me as we examined the exhibition of nominated projects. But more than that, you've shown people that success doesn't require sacrificing your values or your connection to place. That's a powerful message. The cocktail reception before the awards ceremony provided an opportunity to reconnect with Chicago's design community, many of whom remembered me from my previous incarnation as Derek's wife rather than as an independent professional. Their surprise at my transformation was gratifying in ways I hadn't expected. Validation that my growth was visible to others as well as meaningful to myself. Dr. Patricia Summers, a professor at the Art Institute who had taught some of my favorite graduate courses, approached me with particular warmth. "Rachel, I've been following your work in Vermont with such admiration. You've accomplished exactly what I hoped you would when you were my student, before you got distracted by trying to fit into someone else's vision of your potential." Her words reminded me that people had seen my authentic capabilities, even when I'd been too caught up in Derek's expectations to recognize them myself. The woman I'd become wasn't entirely new. She was the person I'd always had the potential to be when freed from the constraints of accommodating someone else's limitations. As the evening progressed, I found myself genuinely enjoying the professional conversations, the creative energy, and the opportunity to share ideas with like-minded colleagues. This was the Chicago experience I'd never had during my marriage, when my role at professional events had been supportive rather than substantive, decorative rather than contributory. The award ceremony itself was elegant and inspiring, celebrating innovations that proved environmental responsibility and commercial success were not only compatible but mutually reinforcing. When my project won the Innovation in Eco-Luxury category, the standing ovation from my peers felt like recognition not just of my work but of the journey that had led to its creation. My keynote address the following morning drew the largest audience of the conference, with additional attendees joining virtually from around the world. I spoke about the importance of authentic vision in sustainable design, about the courage required to pursue unconventional paths, and about the necessity of aligning professional work with personal values for long-term satisfaction and impact. Too often, we allow others to define success for us, I told the audience. We accept limitations on our creativity, our ambitions, and our potential because we're afraid that pursuing our authentic vision might require leaving behind security or comfort or approval. But true success comes from building work and life that reflect our deepest values, even when that path looks different from what others expect or recommend. The response was overwhelmingly positive, with multiple speaking requests and collaboration proposals emerging from the audience. Publishers approached me about expanding my keynote themes into a full-length book about sustainable career development in creative fields. Several universities invited me to develop curriculum for graduate programs in environmental design. Most significantly, the mayor of Chicago approached me after my presentation with an unexpected proposition. The city was planning a major green building initiative for public housing developments, and they wanted me to lead the design team. The project would be high-profile, well-funded, and positioned to influence sustainable development practices in major metropolitan areas across the country. "We need someone with your expertise and vision to show that environmental responsibility can enhance, rather than compromise urban living quality," Mayor Johnson explained. "This project could become a model for cities nationwide, and your leadership would ensure it meets the highest standards for both sustainability and livability." The offer was professionally thrilling and personally validating, recognition that my work had achieved the kind of impact I'd always dreamed of making. It was also an invitation to return to Chicago permanently, to rebuild a life in the city where I'd once felt so constrained and diminished. I requested time to consider the proposal, knowing that the decision would require careful evaluation of how it would affect the life I'd built in Vermont and the values that had guided my transformation. That evening, I walked through downtown Chicago, revisiting places that had once been familiar but now felt like exhibits from a previous existence. The restaurant where Derek and I had celebrated his promotion to senior associate was still there, its wine list and decor unchanged but somehow smaller and less impressive than I remembered. The building where we'd lived together looked exactly the same, but I felt no nostalgia for the expensive apartment where I'd gradually made myself smaller to accommodate his expanding ego. Most tellingly, I felt no urge to contact Derek or to learn how his career had progressed since our divorce. The man who had once been the center of my universe had become genuinely irrelevant to my happiness and success, a chapter in my story that had ended definitively rather than lingering as unfinished business. I was staying at a boutique hotel in River North when my phone rang with an unexpected call. Maria Santos, my original collaborator on the Vermont Retreat Center, had news that would complicate my decision about the Chicago mayor's offer. A consortium of international investors wanted to fund a network of sustainable retreat centers across New England, with me as the lead designer and creative director for the entire initiative. "This could be bigger than anything we've imagined," Maria explained excitedly. "They're talking about 15 to 20 properties, each one designed to showcase different aspects of environmental innovation while providing luxury experiences that reconnect guests with natural environments. You'd have unprecedented creative freedom and financial backing to establish sustainable tourism as a major industry category. The international project would allow me to expand my impact while remaining based in Vermont, building on the community relationships and landscape connections that had become central to my personal and professional identity. It offered the scale and influence I craved without requiring me to abandon the authentic lifestyle that had made my transformation possible. As I considered both opportunities, I realized that the choice itself represented the kind of agency I'd never possessed during my marriage to Derek. I could choose based on my own priorities and values rather than on what would best support someone else's ambitions. I could evaluate options according to their potential for creative fulfillment, environmental impact, and personal satisfaction rather than simply accepting whatever circumstances others created for me. The decision crystallized as I walked past Union Station, the site where Derek had abandoned me and inadvertently set me free to discover my authentic potential. The Chicago mayor's offer was prestigious and important, but it would require adapting my vision to urban political realities and compromising my creative independence in ways that felt too familiar. The International Retreat Network would allow me to expand my impact while preserving the autonomy and authenticity that had become non-negotiable aspects of my professional identity. I called Maria from the train station plaza to accept the international project, feeling the symbolic rightness of making this choice in the place where my transformation had begun. The abandoned woman who had once stood here feeling lost and powerless had become someone who turned down prestigious opportunities that didn't align with her vision. Someone confident enough in her own judgment to choose creative freedom over conventional prestige. My last evening in Chicago included dinner with several colleagues who had become genuine friends through my professional resurrection, people who respected my work and valued my perspective independently of any romantic or social connections. The conversation was stimulating and supportive, focused on creative challenges and industry innovations rather than personal gossip or career positioning. As I prepared to leave the restaurant, Jennifer mentioned that she'd seen Derek earlier that day at a coffee shop near Morrison Associates, looking stressed and checking his phone constantly in ways that suggested ongoing professional pressure. The observation sparked curiosity rather than concern, interest in how my former husband's life had evolved, rather than investment in his well-being or success. "He looked like someone still trying to impress people who don't really care about him," Jennifer added thoughtfully. "Very different energy from what you have now, where you seem genuinely comfortable with who you are and what you've accomplished." Her comparison highlighted the fundamental difference between authentic confidence and performative ambition, between living according to internal values and constantly seeking external validation. Derek was apparently still trapped in the same cycle of people-pleasing and approval-seeking that had made our marriage unsustainable, while I had learned to measure success by my own standards rather than by others' recognition. The next morning brought an unexpected encounter that would provide perfect closure to my Chicago visit. I was waiting for my train back to Vermont when I noticed a familiar figure across the platform, Derek himself, apparently traveling for business with the same expensive luggage and anxious energy I remembered from our marriage. He was absorbed in a phone conversation that seemed both urgent and frustrating, his voice carrying the strained tone of someone trying to manage a crisis while maintaining professional composure. Victoria Sterling's name came up several times, suggesting that his relationship with his demanding boss remained as central to his identity as it had been during our marriage. For a moment, I considered approaching him, curiosity about how he might react to seeing the woman he'd dismissed as engaging in rural fantasies now celebrated as a national leader in sustainable design. But as I watched him pace and gesture, clearly stressed about whatever professional emergency demanded his immediate attention, I realized that any conversation would be anticlimactic. Derek represented a version of success that no longer held any appeal for me, a lifestyle that prioritized external achievement over personal fulfillment, individual advancement over meaningful contribution, financial accumulation over authentic purpose. He wasn't my enemy or my failure. He was simply someone whose values had proven incompatible with my own, someone who had inadvertently done me an enormous favor by making our incompatibility impossible to ignore. Instead of approaching him, I boarded my train and settled into my seat with the satisfaction of someone who had definitively chosen her own path. Through the window I could see Derek still pacing and talking, still managing crises and seeking approval, still living the life I'd once thought I wanted but had learned to recognize as a beautiful prison. As the train pulled away from Union Station, I felt no regret about the life I was leaving behind, no nostalgia for the woman I'd been when Derek's approval had seemed essential to my happiness. The city where I'd once felt trapped and diminished was now simply one more place where I'd given successful presentations and built professional relationships, significant but not central to my identity or well-being. The Vermont mountains came into view as our train approached Millbrook, their familiar silhouettes representing home in ways that Chicago never had, even during the years when I'd lived there. Frank would be waiting at the station to drive me back to my cabin, where my studio was ready for work on the International Retreat Network designs. Helen would have prepared a welcome home dinner featuring vegetables from her garden and stories about community developments I'd missed during my brief absence. More importantly, I would return to work that excited me, to relationships that nourished me, and to a life that reflected my authentic values rather than someone else's expectations. The woman who had been abandoned at a train station had used that abandonment to discover strength, creativity, and happiness she'd never known she possessed. My phone buzzed with a text from Amy Chen. "How did Chicago treat our returning hero?" The message made me smile with its assumption that I was their returning hero rather than someone who had left their community to pursue opportunities elsewhere. Vermont had claimed me as completely as I had claimed it, creating mutual belonging that felt both surprising and inevitable. I typed back. Chicago was professionally successful but personally irrelevant. Ready to be home and get back to real work. The distinction between professional success and personal fulfillment, between external achievement and authentic purpose, had become central to how I evaluated opportunities and made decisions. As I watched familiar landscapes pass outside the train window, I reflected on the journey that had brought me from accommodating wife to independent entrepreneur, from supporting character to protagonist, from seeking approval to trusting my own judgment. The transformation hadn't been easy or immediate, but it had been thorough and irreversible. Derek had intended to teach me a lesson about dependence when he abandoned me at Union Station. Instead, he had accidentally taught me about independence, about the difference between being alone and being free, about the possibility of building a life that reflected my own priorities rather than adapting to someone else's limitations. The train pulled into Millbrook's small station just as the sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in colors that no urban environment could match. Frank was indeed waiting with his pickup truck, ready to help carry my luggage and hear about my Chicago adventures. As we drove through the village where I'd found my authentic self, I felt profound gratitude for the circuitous path that had led me to this moment. I was no longer the woman who had been abandoned at a train station, though I would always be grateful to her for having the courage to choose uncertainty over security, growth over stagnation, authenticity over accommodation. I was someone who had learned to value her own judgment, pursue her own vision, and build relationships based on mutual respect rather than one-sided compromise. The gold-plated luxury of my current success wasn't material. It was the luxury of living according to my own values, of work that mattered to me, of relationships that enhanced rather than diminished my authentic self. Derek's face when he saw my transformation might have been priceless, but the transformation itself was invaluable in ways that transcended any external recognition or revenge fantasy. I had become exactly who I was meant to be, and no one could ever abandon me from that identity because it belonged entirely to me. The woman who had always been fine had finally learned the difference between being fine and being free, and she would never settle for anything less than complete authenticity again. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.